Okay, so I just want to go through the process of answering a question 11 movement analysis. Now, what we know already from previous explanations and videos is that question 11s are always 8 marks. They're an extended question and they are marked in a very specific way, unlike your short answers where if it says name 2 somethings for 2 marks, you get a mark per each point. This is marked differently, and I'll show you the way that examiners or we will be marking your question 11s in a bit. The other thing we know already, hopefully, is that it's about analysing the axial and appendicular skeletons and how those two parts of the skeleton allow us to move in certain ways. So from this part of the question, we know we've got to specifically only talk about skeletal details, skeletal information. We know that this does not require any muscular actions or contractions or naming. You get no marks for going anywhere near muscular information for question 11. The other thing we can deduce from the actual wording of the question is that you will be asked to analyse 3 joints or 3 areas of the body. So the left hip in this example, the left knee and the trunk. The trunk refers to the vertebral column. Knee obviously and hip are pretty much straightforward, although it has specified the left, and what they often do is they shade the limb if they don't want you to be confused, so that you answer differently for the other side of the body. Finally then, and very importantly, the movement will be described in text. So it says here to move from preparation to execution. It's also got really important information in this bit of text. So figure 5 shows an athlete completing a forward lunge with a twist. Now your answer must relate to this specific movement and you must write about it in your answer. What we do not want is just bare facts about the skeleton, the joints, the bones, and then you don't refer in your answer to the lunge or the twist. It must be part of your answer, particularly if you want top grades from this kind of an exam question. Again, so as well as the text, it shows you the movement. This is the starting point, the preparation phase, moving into and executing this action to get to this position. So they want you to describe that, okay, that movement. Again, overtly talk about these phases or these movements in your answer for top grade marks. Now, I'm coaching you to have a knowledge-based starting point for these questions. You have to know the joints, the bones, movements, planes, in order to answer them. But I'm also going to coach you how to add some extra detail, some additional information to try and get you to the top level of marking or marks available. So minimally, this is what we've looked at. We remember the Justin Bieber acronym SEXY, which was referring to the skeleton. Is it axial or appendicular? Justin, which referred to the joints, both knowing if it's which joint classification it is and which type of synovial joint it is. SEXY Justin Bieber was what are the articulating bones, Bieber bones. Planes and movement comes together, and what movement is occurring in what plane. And very much this must be related to the question, so it must be related to this movement, the lunge and the twist in this example. Okay, so fundamentally you have to know this information. That's knowledge. These are the basic ingredients of your answer. So if I use a recipe or a cake as a sort of an analogy, these are the basic ingredients to make the cake, to create your answer. Without this knowledge, you can't answer. Okay, so you have to learn this stuff. You have to get familiar with this stuff. There are other bits of information though we can look at and we can add. So if I wanted to add some icing to my cake, if I wanted to add some additional information to my cake, if I was looking at the skeletal information, appendicular and axial skeleton, the sort of stuff I might add extra to this, you must have this, but extra to this is possibly talking about the main function of the appendicular skeleton or the main function of the axial skeleton. So movement or protection, or to attach the limbs to attach the appendages to. If I was going to add some icing to my joint information, I could not just state that it was a synovial joint, I could add a little bit extra and say, and these are freely movable joints. By design, they have synovial fluid, joint capsules, which structurally enable the joints to be multi-axial. They move in all three planes, and lots of movements can be done. They have the greatest range of movement: abduction, adduction, rotation. You don't necessarily need to list them all, but show that you know all movements can be done at these joints. Or similarly, cartilaginous is different. So you could add additional information about the joint classification you're talking about. What additional icing information could I put about joint types? Well, I could talk about the structure. This might link a little bit to the bones. So I could, for example, for ball and socket hip joint, I could talk about the femur, the head of the femur, sitting in the deep socket of the pelvis. And I could note that because it's structured as a ball and a socket, this means that the ball and socket has the greatest range of movement of all of the synovial joints. It can do every movement possible. And you could add that in order to keep this joint quite stable, we've got lots of ligaments and lots of muscles holding that ball into the socket. Compare that with the shoulder joint, which is also a ball and socket, which is a shallower socket. The shoulder is more vulnerable and less stable. So I could chuck in some extra show-off icing knowledge on the structure of the bones or the structure of the joint. In terms of the movement, perhaps there's not lots of extra information, but this is where you must link it to the action specifically happening. So the hip, I'd say the hip and the knee actions are to do with the lunge. And in this example, I'd say the trunk was to do with the twist bit. So specifically say that in your answer and say the hip contributes to the lunge action where the performer lowers their body towards the ground by flexion at the hip in the sagittal plane. You could also show off that you know what flexion means, and you could say this is where the angle at the joint is reduced, and you could show off that you know what this means about the plane. So the sagittal plane divides the body into left and right sides. So minimally, you must learn the ingredients of the answer, the facts. If you want to aim for the higher levels of answer, you will need to be adding some additional information. You'll need to be adding some icing to these key bits of information. Okay? Now I've provided with you already a basic writing frame to try to help you structure your answer, talking through those points. That's absolutely brilliant. If you minimally answer that, you should be certainly up to sort of mid-range points. But I'm going to show you in a bit the marking scheme that asks you to add in additional information and to synthesize. That's a really important word, to draw in information from other topics. You know, as I was saying, draw in information from types of synovial joint, draw in information from classifications of joint or bone types. So any extra information you can synthesize and draw together and integrate into your answer will make you a higher mark grade. So what I've done is I have written a sort of a model answer. There'll be different versions of a model answer, but I wanted to show you the sort of way you might construct your paragraph. Now remember, the question asks you about, sorry to flip around, 3 joints, 3 sections of information. You should have 3 separate paragraphs, and I think it's a good idea to subtitle them. So talk about the left hip and the movement, talk about the left knee and the movement, talk about the trunk and the movement. Separate your information. Do not integrate information about all 3 into one paragraph. It won't work. It will be very confusing. You will definitely not be a top grade student if you do that. So 1 paragraph on the left hip. And what I've tried to show you, obviously this could just be 1 paragraph, but I've tried to separate them a little bit just to illustrate. This is about the skeletal information. This is about the joints and bones. I happen to have integrated it. This is about the planes and movement, which is often integrated. So I've colour coded to try and illustrate my basic recipe, cake recipe ingredients, and I've tried to show you my icing. The black are the facts. These are the basic ingredients. The hip is part of the appendicular skeleton. It's a synovial classification. It's a ball and socket joint. The bones are the femur and the pelvis, and the hip is moving from doing flexion in the sagittal plane. That's your basic answer. That will get you a low to low medium grade. If you want medium to high grades, then you've got to add your icing, your additional facts. So I've shown off that I know that the hip is part of not just the appendicular skeleton, but it's the pelvic girdle. It's what the leg attaches to. It's the connection point between the leg, the appendicular skeleton, and the axial skeleton. Extra show-off icing information. I've shown off that I know that synovial joints are freely movable. They've got the highest range of movement. I've shown off that I know specific information about the bones. So I know that actually the pelvis is 3 fused bones, flat bones, and the ischium is where the socket is. And the socket actually has a special name, the acetabulum. Now, you may not remember all of that, but I'm trying to show you the sorts of stuff you might add to your answer. I'm now going to show off that I get synovial joints have lots of ligaments to hold them in place, to stabilise them. And I'm showing off that I know the hip is a deeper socket than the shoulder, which makes it, both of those things make it more stable. I'm showing off that I know that the hip, ball and socket joint is multi-axial and can move in all 3 planes. And I've very briefly illustrated that. I'm showing off that I know that not just is it flexion in the sagittal plane, but that I'm specifically referring to the question, moving from the upright preparation position to the lunge position. So from that to that, I'm writing it down. I'm showing that I'm relating it to the question. The hip moves in extra. And actually I'm going to type in additionally, and I could put in there which divides the body into left and fat fingers and right sides. Brilliant. Oh my goodness me. And right sides. So that would be a nice little bit of additional icing, showing off information, just make it green, about the plane stuff. I could add from H2 flexion, reducing the angle at the joint. That would be an extra bit of show-off green information. So you might not get all of this in your first paragraph, but I'm showing you what you can do. Let me very quickly go through the second one. So the left knee, I've actually grouped them. The 2 ones that make the lunge I've put together. So the left knee is also part of the appendicular skeleton. It's a hinged synovial joint. It is structured with a cylinder and a trough. Extra icing about the joint, allowing only movement in the sagittal plane. So I'm showing off I get that the structure of the joint affects its function, its range of movement. And I've talked about the movement itself. It's only flexion and extension allowed at this hinge joint. The synovial fluid within the joint capsule, extra stuff, helps lubricate the joint and reduce bone friction or movement friction on the bones during the flexion. The tibia articulates with the femur and patella to allow the knee to move in the sagittal plane from the position, linking to the question, to the flex position when they lunge and lower themselves, linking to the question. Showing off collateral and cruciate ligaments are essential in stabilising the knee joint. There are ligaments there. Lastly, the trunk. The trunk is responsible for the twist part of the action, so I've gone straight in with question context. The trunk is part of the axial skeleton, which is the central axis of the body. Additional icing information. The irregular bones of the vertebrae articulate to make the vertebral column, talking about the type of bone. And the vertebral column is mainly, and in this movement we're mainly talking about the lumbar and thoracic vertebrae sections for this movement, is made mostly out of cartilaginous classification joints, tick, which have limited movement in all directions, and ligaments that keep them quite stable to protect the spinal cord. additional icing information. There are also gliding joints between the spinous processes, showing off that I know the specific terminology and where those gliding joints are, the sticky out bits on the back of your vertebrae. During the execution phase, linking to the question, the trunk remains relatively extended, but the vertebral joints rotate, that's the movement, in the transverse plane, that's the plane, to add the twist action linking to the question. Also, the spinous processes slide over each other, that's the gliding joints. So I hope you can see from that, I've given my basic ingredients, my black facts. I've added question context throughout my paragraphs, my blue content. And I've given lots of additional icing information, my green stuff. Now I just want to finish by showing you the mark scheme and the way in which the examiners will mark your work to show how you get your grades. So here's your mark scheme. It starts off with a bit of guidance to the examiners, to the assessors who are going to mark everybody's scripts. Says you're expected to give answers in line with this information. So this is your starting point for your information. This is the black and white ingredients of your answer. What they're looking for and expecting is interrelationships, making connections between these things and the question. They're expecting you to give additional information to show that you know more than just these basic facts about the skeletal system, to show your understanding, your deeper understanding. And your grades will be based on the detail and depth, not just the minimal facts. So that's the basic mark scheme. Then it gives the assessors guidance on the sort of extra stuff that they will look for. They're looking for additional stuff about the range of movement at the synovial joints due to the shape of the bones and the structure of the joint, and talking about the ligaments that also are connected to synovial joints. They're looking for joint shape determining range of movement. So for example, in my my knee joint, talked about the hinge joint allowing only the structure of the hinge joint only allowing movement in one plane, and the surfaces, articulating surfaces. So gliding joints have flat surfaces that slide over each other. Types of movement available at those joints. So you could give your general information about these as well as the specific movement about the question example, and knowledge about the bones of the axial and appendicular skeleton. So what's the main function? What are other bones within the axial skeleton? You need to know obviously which they are. Then it gives you the specific joint information. So hips, ball and socket, it's femur and the pelvis. It's got a great range of movement at the hip due to the shape of the articulating bones, the round ball and the deep socket, to enable you to give a lunge position, and its flexion, and it's when they lower, so it relates to the question. The hinge, the knee is a hinge joint. It's the femur and the tibia. As the hinge works, it's only able to work in one plane, sagittal plane. Basic facts. In the picture we can see, that's a nice phrase for you to use to link to your question. The knee is in flexion as the joint angle decreases. That's defining flexion in order to achieve the lunge position relating to the question. The trunk, it's got both gliding and cartilaginous joints. It's formed by the vertebra of the vertebral column. You could be more specific than that. You can talk about the lumbar or thoracic or cervical. There's limited movement at all of those joints to protect us, to keep the joints stable. It's got ligaments, but it allows rotation of the joints in the trunk and occurs in the transverse plane. That's your basic answer. But this is the key stuff. So, make it a bit smaller. The way these questions are marked is not every fact you give correctly you get a mark. This is called levels marking. So the assessor will read your answer and will decide which level you're in out of these three. And it's based on this criteria. Do you give isolated knowledge? Do you know some facts but not loads? Do you refer to the question or not at all? Do you make general statements rather than connecting your answers in a logical way Do you actually answer the question, or do you just chuck out facts? Do you give clear, organised answer, and do you use technical language? If not, you're going to be level 1, and you'll get somewhere between 1 and 3 marks out of 8. If you have mostly given accurate information, if you do refer to the question a bit, maybe not enough, but a bit, if you do make some connection with, your details, and if you do try to give some technical language, but it's not necessarily all clear and organised information, you'll be level 2, and you'll get somewhere between 4 and 6 marks. What we're aiming for is to be level 3 students, level 3 answers, which requires you to demonstrate accurate knowledge and understanding throughout the question, give sustained coverage of the information in relation to the question, so referring to it regularly in each paragraph. Demonstrate your ability to integrate and synthesize. I think those words are really important. Integrate and synthesize. Draw your information together. Link information about joints, bone shape, joint structure, ligaments, movement possible, functions of being stable. Pick it up and put it together and make sense of it. This is the extra stuff, making interconnections, additional stuff, extra icing information, making links between structure, movement, naming things, range of movement. And then, of course, using terminology, being organised in your answers. That way you're going to get 7 or 8 marks and you're going to be a top level answer student. Okay, so I hope combination of the breaking down the question, showing you possible ways of answering them, the model answer, maybe think about the colours. So if blue, you've got to in your paragraphs have some blue, some black, some green, and it should be integrated and organised. Then hopefully we can get you being top level answers. Okay.